This is Green Street, the environmental health show, greenstreetnews.org. Patti and Doug Wood and our worldwide network of experts here every week to talk about what's going on in the world that you need to know to keep yourself and your family safe and healthy. Welcome back. There's a lot of talk these days about the incredible power demands of cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, and data centers, users that are grouped together under a new term, hyperscalers. Some of these companies are building their own natural gas-powered generating plants to supply the power they need. Others, like Microsoft, are using energy from old nuclear facilities to provide power, while Apple and other companies are trying to power their operations with 100% renewable energy. This increasing need for power has spawned a whole array of companies promising solutions, including the old but still powerful and influential nuclear power industry, which sees the current demand for power as the perfect opportunity to get back in the game. Today on Green Street, we'll talk with one of the leaders of the movement to stop nuclear power from getting back into the power game and what we could and should be doing instead. That's all coming up on this edition of Green Street, but first, some of the headlines of the week. Patti, what do you got for us this week?
Well, finally, I have something about the radiation coming from electric cars.
Okay.
So there's a new website, carsradiation.org, carsradiation.org, which is now available for drivers, buyers, engineers, health professionals, and policymakers looking for reliable data on electromagnetic field exposure inside electric and hybrid vehicles.
You've been talking about this forever.
For a long time,
but
I didn't have something to share.
Okay, yeah.
Shaul Shulman, co-founder and co-CEO of Safe Fields Technology and contributing editor at carsradiation.org, says, quote, "With millions of people now spending hours each week in electrified vehicles, it's critical that the public has access to clear, science-based information about in-car radiation, its sources, and potential health effects. We aim to bridge the gap between industry data and public knowledge."
So I heard about this a while ago. I went online, I looked at this video. There was a promotional video, I guess, for the electric car industry, talking about how there's not enough EMFs in the car to cause you any kind of trouble. And then they talk about all the efforts they've gone to limit the amount of EMFs in the car.
To shield
it's like either it's dangerous and you're putting in all this stuff to try to shield it, or it's not dangerous. But
Right.
You can't have both.
Right. But if you're thinking about buying an electric car, or if you already have an electric car and you're concerned about the potential health risks of spending a lot of time in it, you might want to check out carsradiation.org to learn more.
Very, very interesting. All right, what else you got?
Well, there's a new article that was just published in the journal Nature, and this is scientists who worked at government agencies who are now gone. Okay, they've lost their jobs.
Yeah.
And they're speaking out about the irreplaceable facilities, the institutional knowledge, and the training opportunities that this country is losing.
Okay.
For 30 years, the EPA has conducted controlled air pollution studies at a state-of-the-art facility at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The facility is equipped to test numerous airborne pollutants, including ozone, diesel, wildfire smoke, and chlorine. Data collected at the facility have helped establish stricter air quality standards for deadly pollutants and have been instrumental in protecting public health. But this past February, shortly after President Donald Trump took office, the EPA, which is charged with protecting the nation's environment and its people's health, notified the university that it would not be renewing its lease. By May, all research had ceased.
Jeez.
Robert Devlin, a former EPA researcher who worked at the facility until recently, said, quote, "There are no other places with the capability of doing these studies on the wide range of pollutants that the Chapel Hill facility does," end quote.
Good work, Doge.
Right. So now, as agencies lose scientific expertise and evidence-based guidance, the knock-on effects will be widespread and costly to the economy, to the environment, to public health, and the broader research enterprise. Agency scientists say the cuts will compromise a swath of resources and initiatives, including hurricane forecasting, air quality improvements, public protections against chemical exposures, and efforts to monitor endangered species. Science that falls under the government's purview to protect citizens and the environment.
This is a war on science. They've got a war going. They're going to get rid of science.
That's right.
As, you know, let's get rid of the science and
I
hope for the best.
don't think this administration either understands science or respects it.
No, clearly, there's no respect for science.
Absolutely
Science
not.
just gets in the way of making money. Anything that gets in the way of making money has got to go. All right, we'll be back.
Back in the middle of the last century, scientists and engineers developed a way to create energy from nuclear fission, splitting large atoms of uranium into smaller atoms and thereby releasing large amounts of energy, which was used to heat water and create steam to power turbines and generate electricity. There were problems, of course. Nuclear energy was inherently dangerous. An explosion or leak could contaminate large areas with radioactive particles. It was also incredibly expensive to build a nuclear power plant because of the safety precautions required. And then there was the problem of the nuclear waste and what to do with it. None of these problems was ever solved, but that didn't stop the nuclear energy industry from pushing ahead and convincing state utility officials to approve their plans. But accidents, cost overruns, and the nagging problem of nuclear waste eventually convinced public officials that there were better ways to generate electricity. Fast forward 75 years, and the nuclear industry is back at it, trying to convince state regulators that nuclear power is the answer to our energy problems. But is it? To help answer that question, Doug and I spoke with Tim Judson, Executive Director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service. We spoke with Tim earlier this week and asked him how he became involved in the issue. And here's our interview with Tim Judson.
I've been doing work on nuclear energy and environmental issues since about 1997, 98. And that's, from living in Syracuse, New York, which is, 30 miles downwind from 3 nuclear reactors that are on the shore of Lake Ontario. And I had been sort of a community activist at the time, working on community arts, projects and, various things in my neighborhood. And we found out about some serious safety problems going on with one of the reactors up there. And someone came to town, Helen Caldicott, who's in a deep, sort of
famous
in the anti-nuclear movement, physician who, gave a presentation where she told us, what would happen if there was a serious, nuclear accident up at one of those reactors. And my response to it was really visceral. It took me back to, when I was a kid growing up in the 80s with the nuclear weapons race. And I think similar to what a lot of young climate activists feel today, when I found out about the dangers of nuclear weapons back when I was a teenager, I couldn't understand how my parents and my grandparents' generation had let that happen.
Yeah.
And so when I found out about this issue with the nuclear power plant, which I hadn't really thought of much, even though I'd lived in Syracuse for several years, it took me back to that place. And I realized that, when as a teenager, I wanted my parents and my grandparents to be accountable for, for the dangers that my generation was facing. And I realized that, I'm an adult now. Now, we can't let this happen.
It's your turn to do something about it.
Yeah, and so we started organizing. We didn't really know what we were doing. We didn't know about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. We didn't know about regulations. We didn't even really know how a nuclear power plant operated at the time.
Yeah.
But through sort of having to find the documents and go to NRC meetings and have to say things and find out what was really happening, we learned a lot. And then we connected with groups in other communities that had already been fighting their nuclear power plants in their communities. And we learned a lot more. And so it became, after that point, less even about the dangers of the nuclear accident, which was still a serious concern,
Sure,
but about the pollution that was going on a daily basis. And I had met other people from central New York, from this area, that had been fighting those same reactors for a long time. And and what I learned from them made it really clear that people around in our community have been being poisoned by these reactors for decades. And from that point, I just wasn't able to let go because, the injustice of people getting sick and dying and their relatives dying and never knowing why and never being allowed to know why hit me in a place that, that just, has never sat right with me.
Sure. Yeah.
And so that's why I do what I do.
Yeah. I think a lot of people think of nuclear energy as being dangerous from a radioactive waste point of view, but they don't know much about the ongoing kind of emissions that are happening from nuclear power plants.
Well, I mean, the industry tries to keep these things compartmentalized, right? Like when they acknowledge that there's a nuclear waste issue, they act like it's just, the irradiated fuel that comes out of the reactor. But the reality is that, like, nuclear reactors and the whole sort of supply chain that supports them creates these vast array of radioactive wastes. And a big piece of that is the irradiated fuel. That's the most radioactive piece of it. But mining uranium, milling uranium, enriching uranium, making the fuel, and then putting it in the reactor where the fission happens, creates hundreds of different radioisotopes. And they don't all stay in the reactor.
Sure.
The reactors, routinely release liquid and gaseous effluents into the air and into the water. And then there's lots of other waste that they ship off to dump somewhere else. That are called low-level waste, but that's just because they're not as intensely radioactive as the fuel.
Yeah.
So there's a whole sort of chain of sacrifice, environmental and human sacrifice, that go along with the production of electricity from this industry. And there's someone that another activist that we work with who has a really great sort of analysis of this, and he says that electricity is the fleeting byproduct of the nuclear industry.
That's great.
But what nuclear energy really is these are radioactive waste machines. And that's the main thing that they turn out. The thing that will endure from them, are these wastes that are, they still don't have any solution to them.
Talk a little bit, if you would, about these are the most expensive ways to generate electricity, and they take forever to build. How is it that nuclear is being positioned as the answer to the sudden demand from AI?
There's an easy answer and there's a more complicated answer.
Okay.
The easy answer is it's what the utilities and the government want us to believe is the solution. The more complicated answer is that because that's so obviously wrong, it's because there's a real resistance to transitioning to renewable energy. That was really what the utilities and the energy industries, and a lot of their political backers are trying to achieve, is to block the transition to also more affordable, but less environmentally harmful energy sources like solar and wind and geothermal and whatnot.
I saw a thing the other day that said if the AI companies would only invest in rooftop solar and geothermal for people's homes, they could have all the power they wanted.
That may be true, but we need to transition all of our energy use to renewables, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so, I don't think that the data center industry is under any less of an obligation than the rest of us to also be doing things energy efficient and to be managing their energy consumption, which they're clearly not doing.
Yeah. So maybe we should talk a little bit about these small modular reactors, these SMRs, which seems to be all the rage these days. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, and specifically whether or not these are any safer than any other type of nuclear energy?
Sure. Well, we're hearing a lot these days about various types of new reactors, but like the one you hear most often is they're called small modular reactors. We're also hearing more lately about microreactors and then advanced reactors. And the thing is that there's no hard and fast definitions for these various technologies. But to kind of just go with the flow, small modular reactors are a theory that by building smaller reactors than the really large ones that we're familiar with, and typically they mean reactors that would be like 300 megawatts of electricity or less. So still a big power plant, actually. Yeah. But by making them smaller, they'd be able to build these things in factories, kind of like on an assembly line, and then sort of get those industrial sort of economies of production and manufacturing to be able to make them much cheaper than the large reactors have proven to be.
I see.
To give a sense of that, right? Well, first, we're not building any new reactors in the U.S. today. There's a couple of prototypes that are under construction, but these aren't finalized designs. They haven't been proven yet. No one's building them commercially to generate power. And that's because from the 1970s forward, nuclear power plants have only gotten more and more expensive to build, and they've taken longer and longer to build. And so basically the utility industry, almost bankrupted itself through the 80s and 90s, building the first generation of nuclear plants. And so that stopped in the 90s. No, I mean, in fact, no reactors were ordered after, 3 Mile Island. They'd actually stopped ordering before 3 Mile Island. But basically, they were just building out the things that they'd already ordered in the 80s and 90s. Then the industry got to feel like in the early 2000s that the writing was on the wall, that their existing reactors were only getting older. And if they didn't start to build new ones, then they were going to start to basically reach the end of their rope.
Yeah.
And so they proposed a nuclear renaissance in 2005. Congress passed legislation with billions of dollars in subsidies. Several designers like Westinghouse and General Electric and whatnot had gotten new designs approved for new types of reactors. And so they thought there was going to be this nuclear renaissance. They'd fixed all the problems that had happened in the 80s, and things were going to be cheap and fast to build, and they were going to put up new reactors all over the country within 3 or 4 years, and it was all going to be great. And that quickly proved to be untrue. And so after proposing 30 new reactors before 2009, only 4 of those even ever began construction. And those 4 reactors bankrupted Westinghouse, which has historically been the largest nuclear corporation in the world. More than half the reactors in the world are based on Westinghouse's designs. So 2 of those 4 reactors were canceled. Those are in South Carolina. And then the 2 that were in Georgia, they went forward. And for no good reason. It's just that, the Georgia utilities have a better control over their utility commission. And those were just finished last year, the second of them, after taking 7 years longer than planned to build them and costing $37 billion. It's, $23 billion more than they were originally projected to cost. By the time Vogtle, was reaching the tail end of construction, nobody in the country believed that it was going to be cost effective to build any new large reactors like those.
Yeah.
And so the industry had to come up with a different sales pitch. And so they went back to old ideas that had been tried in the 50s and 60s and never proved out. We ended up with large reactors back in the 70s and 80s because small reactors were too expensive. And the large ones turned out to be too expensive too. So there's no reason to think going backwards was going to help.
Yeah.
But they've got a bunch of Silicon Valley sort of PowerPoint presentations now that make it seem like, innovation is going to solve everything. And so they've been recycling a bunch of old ideas about, building reactors smaller, factory building them, that sort of thing. Nuclear power can be too cheap to meter. And, it's not proving to be true. The SMR company that was furthest along over the last decade was going to start building a project in Utah a couple of years ago. They canceled it 2 years ago because the costs had already started going out of control even before they'd begun construction.
Wow.
But this whole sort of investment craze around these SMRs and microreactors had basically gotten a bunch of nuclear tech bros to start up a couple dozen companies that said they're all working on these different designs. And so there's been a tremendous amount of media hype about this, this wave of innovation in nuclear energy, but it's not producing anything. And so what we're seeing is the cost estimates for these new reactors continue to go up, even though none of them have begun construction yet. And, we're starting to see signs that basically investors, people with the money who've got to decide what they're going to put it into, are starting to get the picture that this is a bubble that could burst any time.
I have 2 questions. What is the major cost? I mean, you keep talking about the original, estimate of how much it's going to cost, but it went way beyond billions of dollars more.
Yeah.
What accounts for that?
Well, there's a number of factors. One is the components. Nuclear reactor components, they have to be very high grade materials because of the really harsh conditions of radiation and heat and pressure and stress that the reactors operate under. So you've got to have very high grade qualities of steel, and then in huge quantities. Like a reactor vessel is more than 6 inches thick of high grade stainless steel, 60 feet tall, 6 inches thick. They're just these huge forging operations to just make the components. Then you've got concrete. We've got these huge containment domes and structures that have to be really robust to be able to withstand earthquakes and other types of events. And so the amount of concrete, I heard someone told me last week, actually, that they tallied up the amount of concrete that went into building the 2 new reactors in Georgia. and it'd be enough to build a road from Georgia to Washington State.
Oh my God.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so it's huge amounts of these of materials that also have to be very high grade. Then the machines themselves are extraordinarily complex, right? Because they're dangerous. They have to be built with lots of backup safety systems and and very high quality valves and whatnot. I mean, thousands of miles of electrical cabling to power and control all the systems. And so there's that. And then there's the labor costs. Because, like at the peak of construction of the reactors in Georgia, there were 9,000 people on that site.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so there's labor costs, there's the high cost of materials, there's the complexity of the machines themselves that just require a lot of additional building. It's way different than building a coal plant. And then you get into the problems that they have in the designs. When they started building the reactors in Georgia and South Carolina, the designs weren't finalized. And then Fukushima had happened in the meantime. And so there were also changes to the regulations to make sure that you don't have the same kind of disaster in one of these reactors.
Sure. Yeah.
So they also had a lot of engineering costs, to be able to finish the designs and everything. And so all that, sort of all those factors caused the cost to go up. Now what they've got, in addition to all that, right, are tariffs and high inflation rates and high interest rates that are also jacking up the cost of constructing most anything at this point. But
Sure.
but that hits nuclear plants, exactly in their weakest spot.
So does the cost also take into account what they have to do with the waste?
The answer to that is no. In fact, it doesn't even count the cost of decommissioning the reactors, which is also a cost that's built into building one of these things.
Wow.
And when a reactor retires, like the ones at Indian Point, the decommissioning of a reactor can cost $1 billion or more per reactor.
I have to ask this question because, we live in New York here and we have a governor who's all over this idea of building these small modular reactors. From your perspective, what would you say to Governor Hochul?
Well, it's not going to fix any of the problems that she's trying to solve, or at least what she says she's trying to solve, right? I mean, building new reactors, like the Vogtle reactors took 18 years from the time that they were proposed to the time that the second reactor came online.
Wow.
So we say it takes 10 years to build a reactor. That's just the construction. Like that's just once you actually get to start building the foundations of the building.
Sure. Yeah.
But
it takes
they
several
need
years
it
to plan.
now, right? They need it now.
Well, right. So I live in Syracuse, where one of the reasons that Hochul's proposing new reactors is because there's this huge microchip plant that the federal and state and local governments are financing or subsidizing that would consume as much electricity as 2 states. This one facility. This microchip plant would consume as much electricity as Vermont and New Hampshire combined.
Wow.
The plant's supposed to start coming online in like 2031, just 6 years from now. And so it would take into to 2040 at least to get a new nuclear reactor built here, when this thing is going to is going to start consuming power in 5 or 6 years. Does none of it really make sense from a standpoint of how are we going to meet our energy needs? Even with and with these large facilities like data centers and microchip plants and whatnot are just going to be increasing the energy demand. We have a law in New York, the CLCPA, the Community Leadership, Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, that that sets some concrete goals for advancing renewable energy at scale to meet both the climate crisis and our future energy needs. And she's basically ignoring those targets. Instead, she's focusing on these things that are going to push us even farther and farther off our targets. The reality is, we need to be pushing renewable energy in New York, not these things that are going to cost way too much and take way too long.
So if I was able to wave a magic wand, Tim, and make you in charge of energy for the entire country, how would you move forward to meet the energy demands of the future?
Well, we need to prioritize building out renewable energy. And that can sound like, a really sort of disruptive undertaking, right? But the reality is, we can help make farming economically sustainable by, enabling farmers to be able to put up windmills and solar on their farms alongside the agricultural production.
Sure.
One of the things we hear a lot these days is complaints about solar farms, displacing farmland. And it's not the way that it needs to work. Also, we're losing a hell of a lot more farmland to warehouses and data centers and suburban development than we are to renewable energy.
Yeah.
If you go to the Midwest, if you go to Texas, even if you go to some places in New York, you'll find farming going on around windmills and around solar panels that is making life easier for the farmers who, and we're not doing anything to make farming easier in this country, but renewable energy, can be integrated into farmland to do that. We can also integrate, solar energy into our buildings, into our homes, into parking lots, to be able to get a better use out of our rooftops than we're getting. And then there's energy efficiency, right? And so, we have lots of buildings that, including our homes, that can be made more energy efficient and, and also improve the quality of life in our buildings by by reducing energy losses in the building envelopes, by insulating, by converting, to all electric appliances and, and geothermal and air source heat pumps to be able to, to reduce the pollution both in our communities and in our homes. So all these things, can happen, and they're happening in certain states in the U.S. They're also happening in other places of the world.
How about coordinating? How about working together with, these huge warehouses like, Amazon and, whatever, and putting solar panels on their roofs?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's, it should be
do
seen
that?
as,
Make them look like heroes.
Well, and the thing is that, these things also will save those building owners money.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just that the incentives are all misaligned. So, for instance, with the data center construction, data centers could be putting solar panels, on their rooftops. They could also be reducing their energy consumption, right? And the problem is that they're not required to. So, like, for instance, this year in Maryland was the first time I've seen a piece of legislation introduced in a state where they were actually proposing energy efficiency standards for data centers.
Good.
But right now, you can build a data center any way you want, including, consuming, thousands of megawatts of electricity. But that then puts all these costs on the rest of us because of the way it impacts the electricity system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so I think that, that if we were requiring data centers, just like, refrigerators have energy efficiency standards.
Correct.
Then why shouldn't data centers have energy efficiency standards?
Hello.
Okay, Tim Judson. So let me ask you this. When you go to work every day, are you optimistic about what we might be able to achieve in the future?
Well, I think the answer to that question is wrapped up with everything else going on in the country. It's not for nothing that President Trump's, one of his first executive orders on day one of the new administration was to declare an energy emergency and, and to put development of fossil fuels and nuclear energy at the top of the priority list. I think we've got a lot of problems to solve politically in our country that are bound up with the current reactionary environment. And so I think that the organizing that people are doing, both in the climate movement and in the broader movements for democracy and justice, is building power and a vision of a better way in this country that can come around. But I think we've got a real fight on our hands, on every front. And so I think that we need to be looking at what is our vision for a better country. That includes, a better environment and, and a sustainable climate future, a livable planet, and, having more economic security and more, and more equality and justice in our communities.
Tim Judson, Executive Director of the Nuclear Information and Resource Service, talking about nuclear energy, the problems associated with nuclear, and the opportunities we have to do better. You can learn more about Tim and his organization at nirs.org. I want to remind you that all of our shows are archived on our program website, along with links to our guests, links to the news items we cover, and other helpful resources. That's all at www.greenstreetnews.org. That's going to do it for this edition of the show. Patti and I will be back again next week with another edition of Green Street. Thanks for listening.